Okay, I promise this is going to be brief. This section takes place in a city called Selçuk in Turkey, which in Greco-Roman times was called Ephesus, which is where the Apostle John, according to legend, lived and with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and where he wrote his gospel. So it's a very important place if you're interested in the Apostle John. So this chapter comes from my account of visiting Ephesus/Selçuk. And it's near the end of the chapter when I meet two tourists, so I'm just going to jump right in. I saw two obviously Western tourists heading up St. Jean Street. It's St. John Street is the name that the Basilica of St. John, which is an ancient ruin, is on. So I see these two obviously Western tourists heading up St. Jean Street to the ruins. I decided to follow them. Inside the ruins, pale light fell on the toppled columns in the basilica courtyard, across which the tourists walked in reverent silence. Their names were Isabel and Arthur, mother and son from a place called Towhead on the southern coast of Ireland. Isabel wore a strapless orange tube top, her skin boiled red from where her bikini straps had been. Her face was smooth and covered in a fine white down. She did not appear nearly old enough to be Arthur's mother. Arthur, meanwhile, looked as if he had stepped out of the New Testament and into a backpacker's hostel. Long brown hair, crazy beard, big round irises of pimento-flecked hazel. His t-shirt featured a joint-toking, copyright-infringing Bart Simpson. I learned that Isabel's husband had passed away the year before. Turkey was one of his favorite places in the world. She had come to Selçuk with Arthur so that they could enjoy one last family vacation together. Her husband was with them now, or so it felt to her. "So you've been to St. John's ruins before?" I asked. "No," Isabel said. "This is my first time here. I first saw the Virgin's house several years back with my husband. We came back and saw it a second time, but for some reason we never made it here." "Why not?" "I'm not sure, actually." Her eyes popped open a bit and she looked away, as though fighting off a sudden happy memory of her husband. Her son Arthur sensed what was happening and took her hand. "We're glad we came," he said, while Isabel composed herself. "It's a moving sight. It's extremely moving." "I like it too," I said. Isabel, having recovered, said, "It's interesting for me to put it all in perspective. We know our religion, but not our history." "The history's very interesting," Arthur said. "Have you been to the Virgin's house?" Isabel asked. "I think tomorrow," I said. What I did not say was that I regarded Mary's house as one of many sites around Selçuk whose purported connection to historical fact was even more specious than that of John's tomb. For instance, there was a tower in the administrative region of Roman Ephesus's ruins in which it was said Paul had been kept prisoner. Not too far away from the tower was a small building that, it was once claimed, held the remains of the evangelist Luke. "The Virgin's house is a very special place," Isabel said. "It's such a beautiful, simple sight, and there's all this lovely greenery on the outside. When you go inside and see all the candles and carpets, you have this really quite amazing feeling. Every time you step inside, you feel it." "What kind of feeling?" I asked. "Oh, how can I describe it?" Isabel's face filled with joy, as though being asked to describe the feeling would be akin to re-experiencing it, which for all I knew it was. "First, of course, you feel something like grace, real grace, her grace. You feel all the weight of those Christians who've come before you." "And Muslims," I said. "Yes," Isabel said instantly, brightly. "They're there too, and they're lovely, lovely people." A lot of Muslims worship at Mary's house because she's a pretty important figure in the Quran. In fact, the Quran mentions her more often than the New Testament does. "We're going tomorrow," Arthur said. "I can't wait to see it." Isabel smiled. "He's heard me talk about Our Lady's home for years now. All I can say is that it's a very special place." "Are you here on a mission?" Isabel asked. "Oh, no, nothing like that. I'm just here as a tourist." Isabel allowed my admission to drift serenely past her. "St. John looked after Our Lady, you know. He was the last person to be with her, so he means a lot to me, quite a lot. Even if he hadn't written his gospel, he would still be important to me. He was loved by Jesus," Arthur said. "Of all the apostles, he was Jesus' favorite." Of course, St. John is known in tradition as the beloved disciple. As though the interpersonal dynamics of the Gospels could ever be that apparent. But to Arthur and to many believers, the interpersonal dynamics of the Gospels were precisely that apparent as every miracle, as every word of Jesus. I knew that when evangelical scholars put on their lab coats and took on the air of independent-minded detectives, The results were frequently ludicrous, as when Richard Swinburne, who's a very prominent fundamentalist scholar, as when Richard Swinburne writes that alternative hypotheses for Jesus' miracles have always seemed to me to give a far less satisfactory account of the historical evidence than does the traditional account. Dr. Swinburne, you don't say. Forget that this historical evidence was subject to the editorial control of people emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually committed to believing that everything in the Gospels was true. Forget that the historical evidence the evangelical scholar holds up alongside the work of Tacitus and Thucydides is of a completely different character. Even worse were the evangelical scholars responsible for stuff like this. Theologians working with a Humean definition of a miracle would look on the Easter resurrection of Jesus as a moment when God abrogated the existing laws of nature. Underlying analogy is nomological universality. According to the principle of nomological universality, the same laws that govern the past and present will govern the future as well. This too needs critique. It was as though Michel Foucault emerged from 58 semesters at Oral Roberts University. But if you believed in the Gospels, and you believed that John was the beloved disciple, he was Jesus' favorite, and quite obviously at that. And it felt good suddenly to be reminded by Arthur that not every Christian was an evangelical scholar, that some things, indeed most things, could be true and untrue at the same time, that the untrue could abide with the true as the believer abided with the unbeliever, and that a widow and son too young to lose his father did not need to choose anything right now but how best to honor the ghost they believed could look down at them from the paradise of their understanding. I like the moment when John puts his head in the lap of Jesus during the Last Supper, I told Arthur. It's such a beautiful, sad detail. It's hard to believe, Arthur said, that we're standing so close to his tomb. With this, Isabel swiftly agreed. I was just saying before you came up that there are a few places in this world of ours that you simply must see if you're a Christian, and I think this is one of them. We walked to the edge of the basilica's courtyard, where we looked down the slopes of Ayassaluk Hill over the old fort walls. Beyond the fort walls was the Isa Bay Mosque. Beyond the mosque were little squares of parceled farmland, out of which grew row upon row of grape bushes. And beyond the farmland was the only surviving pillar of the Temple of Artemis, and beyond it the dim blue iridescence of the Aegean Sea. I described to Isabel and Arthur what they were seeing, a leapfrog view from Christianity to Islam to paganism, and said that all three westward-facing structures were clearly meant to replace one another. Which one was Artemis again? Arthur asked. Fertility goddess, I said, but not a Greek or a Roman one. Artemis emerges from myth as a mother goddess called Kybele, which, I went on, explained why her temple in Ephesus was so grand, even though it was built on top of a swamp. She was a local girl, a virgin. Her cult spread everywhere, as far as Scandinavia. So it made some historical sense that the Ephesian Christians latched on to Mary as strongly as they did. You could say that Mary kind of replaced Artemis here. I'm not sure I would say that, Isabel said politely. No, of course, I said, one could say. But then the Greeks got their hands on her, and Artemis was reimagined as the daughter of Leto and Zeus, and it was said that she was born near a spring. Today the House of the Virgin is near that spring. Guess what it's called now? I don't know, Isabel said. Mary Spring? Yep. That's very interesting, Isabel said and laughed. That's actually very interesting. Arthur asked when the Temple of Artemis was destroyed. It had been destroyed a few times, I told him, and the pieces of the ruins were not discovered until 1869, after a long and largely fruitless search by a British surveyor. I wonder, Arthur said, where all of Artemis's people went after her temple was destroyed. It was a good question. After talking a little more, Isabel, Arthur, and I said farewell. We all hoped we would see each other again tomorrow at the House of the Virgin, but we did not. Later I wondered if perhaps the followers of Artemis ran away, but not too far away. Perhaps they gathered in a cave somewhere near the ruins of their goddess. Perhaps they were silent and much afraid. See them looking at one another, huddled, trying to understand what had happened to them and why. Imagine the story that one of them eventually begins to tell.